Hi guys, welcome back, or if you are new here, I'm Laura.
And I'm Jared.
And a couple weeks ago, we shared Kenai's birth story and how it was kind of crazy. He was born at 36 weeks, and he was in the NICU for 29 days, and a lot happened. So today we're going to be sharing our NICU experience, kind of all the things that he went through, and all the things that we learned.
Shortly after Kenai was born, he was taken to the NICU at the hospital where he was born, and they were really concerned about his oxygen levels. Since his oxygen was low, they were trying to get an oxygen tube down his nose. The doctors and the nurses were unable to get that oxygen tube down his nose, so eventually they decided that they needed to intubate him through his mouth to be able to get him that oxygen that he needed.
I remember when I was finally able to see him in the NICU, like after the nurses and the doctor finished up with me, like pushing the placenta out, and then I went to the bathroom. Then a nurse said, okay, if you want, now we can take you over to the NICU and then you can see and hold your baby. So right when I went over there, I was just expecting to go there for them to be like, oh, he's just on oxygen, but here you go, you can hold him. But then I noticed that they were kind of concerned, and they noticed that his oxygen levels just kept dipping. They had a little mask over his nose and mouth to try to help his oxygen stay up, and I wasn't able to hold him. And then, so that's where I kind of realized, like, okay, something is going on.
After about an hour of the doctors and nurses running tests and trying to figure out how to get him that oxygen that he was lacking, the doctor came in and he notified us that they had just made a call to have Kenai transferred to a different hospital where they had a level 3 NICU, because the hospital that he was born in only had a level 2 NICU, and they wanted to make sure that he was getting all the care that he needed, since they weren't sure what was going on and they were having issues trying to get that oxygen at a stable level.
So after the doctor told us that, I was still bleeding and I was in a lot of pain from the epidural still. And so they took me back to the room because they said that it could take a while. And they said that they would let me know as soon as I could see him again. And so I was just in the room waiting with my mom, but Jared stayed in the NICU with him.
After a little while, the paramedics from Lifelight came and they started working on him. They told us they just needed to get him stable, then they would be transferring him over to the other hospital. So it surprisingly took them about 2 hours to get him stable. I remember that in that time I was kind of going back and forth, checking on Laura, making sure she was doing good, and then also coming back and checking on Kenai. And then for a little bit there were just kind of too many people in there, and they were like, okay, there's not room for you. So I just go back and check, and they'd be like, nope, he's still here, we're not going to leave without you. But I was just concerned that they were going to leave and not tell us that they had already gone. So after the 2 hours, they got Kenai sedated, and they got him with a tube with some good tape around it so that he could breathe and that his oxygen levels would be stable. And then they also had him inside of an incubator so that his oxygen and just environment could be a little bit more stable. Kenai. So when they were finished, they had him in an incubator, and they had the tube down his mouth that was taped in place. It was really good and stable, and they had him sedated so that he wouldn't wake up and pull that out of his mouth and make it so that he wasn't getting the oxygen that he needed. So with all those things in place, he was ready, and he was what they called stable. So they wheeled over the incubator for him to be able to say goodbye to his mom.
I remember when they wheeled him in, that was the first time I actually was able to get a good look at him. Just through the incubator, I was there looking and I could see his little face. It was kind of weird to see him just with like all these things attached to him, and just seeing him that he was sedated, that he was fully asleep. But it was reassuring just to see like he had his vital signs over there, and so I knew that he was okay. It was just really hard to see him like that, and I was just really sad that I couldn't hold him. So it was just so weird to just see him there and then to say bye, because I had to stay at the hospital where I was at, and so it was so hard for me knowing that he was going to be in a different hospital.
After Kenai said goodbye to mom, the paramedics wheeled him all the way over to the helicopter and loaded him in there. I was thinking that maybe they would let me ride in there with him too, but they said that I couldn't. So me and my father-in-law ended up driving down to the NICU to meet him there. After the whole loading and unloading process. I think they only beat us by like 5 minutes, and they were starting to get him into his little room area in the NICU. When we got there, they said, oh, you guys only got here like 5 minutes after us. We were down there all alone in the NICU, but it was really weird because I was there with my baby, but I couldn't take him out of his incubator or hold him or touch him at that time. So it was just kind of a little bit weird to be like, okay, we had our baby, but we can't really interact with him at all yet.
And then somehow, luckily, I was actually able to get discharged that night just because I didn't tear at all and my bleeding was going really good and I felt really good physically. And since they knew that my baby was in the NICU in another hospital, then I was able to be discharged early. And so Jared came over and he picked me up and he drove me over to the hospital. And it was really late at this time. I would say it was like 9:30 or 10 when I got discharged and when we went over to the hospital. And I remember going in and then Jared showing me like, okay, like this is where we go in. Okay, this is where our son is at. This is where Kenai is. I remember just seeing him there. I was also really tired and just stressed and worried. And then just seeing him there with all of the different cords connected to him, I got really emotional. I remember I didn't know how to process everything. The nurses there were really nice. One of the nurses was like, okay, let me just explain everything to you because I know it kind of looks a little scary. So then she would say like, oh, this is his oximeter, it's to measure his oxygen, these are his IVs, and you know, just pointed everything out just so that I could understand what was all going on. But it was also a little hard because the nurse practitioner also came and talked to me, and then she just threw a lot of information at me. And then it was also like, oh, his blood pressure is also really low. Usually with his gestational age, it should be higher, and just all these things. And so I just felt really overwhelmed at that time, I remember. And so it was really hard for me to see him there that night. But we stayed there just for a little bit, and so we went home, and I remember we were driving home at like 11 o'clock at night. When we got to our house, we looked at each other and we were like, all of this happened in one day. Like, it was just the craziest day ever because like 24 hours ago, we were at home. I haven't had my baby yet. I was in labor, but I didn't know I was in labor. And so it was just so crazy to think that all of those things happened in just that day.
Yeah, it was a really long day. I remember that when we got home, I think we both just kind of were like, okay, well, this is gonna be NICU life for at least a little while. We went back the next day and we got the latest update from the nurses. They said that his vitals had improved, that it seemed like his heart rate was normal. Just a quick recap from our last video. When he was born, he did have a very high heart rate. The doctors were concerned that he might have something called supraventricular tachycardia. At this point, he hadn't had any more heart episodes. They were thinking that his heart and vitals all looked very normal. They said that his heart and lungs were completely formed, which was something that they were a little bit concerned about since he had the low oxygen, but they said that that was good news for us. They also told us that Kenai had had his first wet diaper, which he hadn't had a wet diaper the whole day before, so they were starting to get concerned, but they said that with that wet diaper that there wasn't really a huge concern there anymore.
So that was good because it seemed like when we got there was just a lot of really good news. That gave us a little bit more hope. And then the ENT came. He was the specialist, the ear, nose, and throat doctor. So he came and he took a look, and then he had this little camera scope thing that he put in through Kenai's nostrils, and he saw that Kenai has something called a choanal atresia, which basically means that the hole, like the openings on the inside of his nose, did not form. So he had like his nostrils, but there was no opening, so he couldn't breathe through his nose. And so he said, oh, it's just that we just need to do surgery and make the openings, and then he should be able to breathe. And so he kind of explained a little bit of what the surgery would look like, and he also told us that Kenai needed a CT scan before having the surgery because they wanted to know if it was just extra tissue that was there that they would have to go through, or if there was also bone. And so they got him ready for a CT scan. He was all bundled up in like this blue thing. They wrapped him up like a little burrito and they took him. And then in the CT scan, they did find that he had tissue and bone. And so since they saw that there was bone and tissue, then they would just have to kind of get rid of that just so then there could be an opening for Kenai. So at this point, Kenai still had not had any of my breast milk. I was pumping the whole time. Like as soon as he left, I just started pumping to get my milk supply coming in, but he was not given any of my breast milk yet. They were waiting on that. So all of the nutrition that he was getting was through an IV. And it was really cool because the IV was actually through his umbilical cord stump. Since he still had the little stump, they were able to do an IV through his umbilical cord. So that's how he was getting the nutrients. They were also able to draw blood from it, right? They were able to draw blood from it. I don't know, it was just so cool. I had no idea that was a thing. And so when I saw that, I was super surprised. That was actually really interesting. I thought that was so cool.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting too. They told us that just for a few days after they're born that they're able to use that, and then they like to try and just limit it to those few days so that it can properly heal and close off like it should naturally. So the day after they did that scan and they found out all about his choanal atresia, they wanted to get the surgery done as quick as possible. So the surgery was scheduled for that next day. So before the surgery, we were there and one of the nurses told us that we could kind of touch Kenai a little bit more. So they took off the blanket and we were able to kind of touch his arms, hands, his belly and chest a little bit. They said that that's really good for them to at least have that interaction. Even though we couldn't hold him and do skin to skin like we wanted to, we were still able to let him feel our presence and touch him there, which I thought was really neat. After we were there with him for a little while, they took him away to do the surgery. It was really cool. They said that they had this little drill that has a camera on it that they just kind of stuck up his nostril, and then they were able to use that to go down in and drill away all that bone and tissue to create the openings. They said that they drilled a little bit of extra because after it healed completely there would be some scar tissue that came and formed that would make the holes a little bit smaller, so they wanted to just make it a little bit bigger. And then they took some pictures that they showed us too. And
right before the surgery started, the ENT told us that he was also going to check Kenai's airway just to make sure that everything looked good, to make sure it wasn't just the choanal atresia, make sure there wasn't anything else going on. And it was really nice and reassuring because one of the nurses, when they were in the operating room, she had my phone number and she was texting me, just kind of giving me updates, and they told us like, oh, the airway looks good, and so they're just gonna start with the surgery. And so that was good because we were a little bit nervous that there might be any more complications or things that would come up, but it was just that. And yeah, like Jared said, afterwards the surgeon showed us pictures. I thought it was really cool seeing those pictures. So the surgery was in the evening. Shortly after the surgery, we just stayed with him for a little bit and then we left. And the next day it wasn't very eventful. The focus was just on having him rest and recover from the surgery. So he was still medicated. He was given medication to help with the pain and he was just sleeping. And so it wasn't eventful, but we were just there with him.
So the next day, 2 days after the surgery and 5 days after he was born, we went in and we got some good news. We noticed immediately that his breathing tube had been removed, so they instead had a nasal cannula. So he was still on oxygen, but no longer had the scary breathing tube that was like taped in 7 places on his mouth. So that was great news. They said that they skipped the CPAP step, which is usually kind of the in-between between the mouth tube and then the nasal cannula. So we were excited to hear that news.
And since he had the breathing tube taken out, that meant that we were finally able to hold him. And so I was so excited. That was just something that I was looking forward to since the moment he was born. The nurses said like, okay, whenever you're ready, you can hold him out. And I said, oh, I'm ready. And so right away I was able to do skin to skin and hold him, and it was just so nice to finally be able to hold him. I felt like after that moment I was like, okay, no matter what else happens, like I'll be okay. I'll be able to get through this. Like after holding my baby, it just gave me that strength that I needed to keep going.
Yeah, it was awesome to finally be able to hold him.
And then they also started giving him my breast milk through a feeding tube. And so that was the only new thing that happened, was they started giving him breast milk through a feeding tube. I wasn't able to breastfeed him yet, or we weren't able to give him feedings by mouth yet, but we were just so glad that we were able to hold him. So that's how we spent pretty much the whole day, was just taking turns holding him and letting him rest.
So the nurses told us that we wouldn't be able to try and feed Kenai by mouth, just by bottle or breastfeeding, until he was off of the high flow of oxygen. So he was on 6 liters of oxygen per minute when we went in, so they needed to get him down to 2 in order to be able to feed him by the bottle.
So the next day, right when we went in, we noticed that the nurses were right away trying to get his heart rate down. We noticed that his heart rate was super fast, just like it was when I was in labor. It was in the 200s. And then the nurses, like, they had a bag of ice that they were putting on him to try to get it to go down. And they told us that he had another little heart episode like that the night before. And so we were just kind of confused, but then the nurses were able to get his heart rate back down. And so they just kind of told us that for some reason he was just having little episodes where his heart rate would go super high.
So we didn't know what to expect from that. There was nothing like conclusive evidence. They just said that he had had those 2 heart episodes and that they were going to look into it. Starting this day, they wanted to have us start to take more of his vitals when we were there. So they did that every so often, that you would go and take all his vitals. So they taught us how to take his temperature. They had a little armpit thermometer that we would use. And then they also showed us how to change his diaper with all the cords that he had. It was a little bit complicated, but didn't take too long to get used to. It was not too different from changing a regular diaper.
They called that cares, that we were doing his cares. And it was nice that we were able to do that because it felt like we were able to contribute something into taking care of him, because it was very limited, the things that we were able to do with him. So it was nice to every once in a while be like, okay, we have to do these things to take care of him, make sure he's okay.
So day 6 in the NICU, we came back and we noticed that the flow of the oxygen had gone down. They said that they felt like he was doing pretty good on the oxygen that he was on, so they started to try to wean him off. They went from 6 liters down to 5 liters, which was a great jump.
This was also a pretty eventful day because at some point during the day he had another heart episode, and this time it lasted for an hour. And the nurses tried several different things to try to have it go back down, things that they did before, like try ice or trying a wet wipe. All these different things that they tried just weren't working. And so they ended up giving him a beta blocker medication, and that helped lower the heart rate down to normal rate. And so after having that long heart rate episode, and then since he had so many other episodes, they decided to order for an ultrasound on his heart so that they could kind of see what was going on, make sure everything was okay anatomically. So he also got a heart ultrasound. We were able to be there. Someone was there scanning it. We don't know a lot about ultrasounds. We actually don't know anything. And so it was just kind of cool to see it, but then we didn't know what was going on. So we were just waiting on that. And then the nurse also told us that when she was checking Kenai, she found she called it a little dimple right at the base of his spine. And so they also ordered for him to have a spinal ultrasound, just because they wanted to see if he had like a little bit of like spina bifida, or if he was going to start having that or something. I'm not exactly sure. They just said that they wanted to check it out just because it was a little bit unusual for him to have that little spinal dimple. So he also had the ultrasound and they saw that it was normal. They said that everything looked normal with the spinal ultrasound, and they also said that the heart ultrasound also looked good. Like everything was just anatomically fine. So at this point it felt really real, this statement of 1 step forward, 2 steps back, where we felt like we were making progress in some ways, but then other ways it felt like we were just going back. And so that was really frustrating for us.
Yep, so we just kept taking it one day at a time. The next day, day 7 in the NICU, we came in and they had scheduled the cardiologist appointment for him to come in and look at Kenai and also to talk to us about where he was at. So he came in and he looked Kenai over, and he noticed that it seemed like when he had these heart episodes, they had some readings that they had taken when he had had those, and they said that it looked like his heartbeat was starting in like 2 different places, which was causing the high heart rate up in the 200s. What they do that is they use a beta blocker to prevent that heart rate from starting in 2 different places. So they gave him a prescription for propranolol, and they said that that should resolve the issue that we were seeing. And they said if it didn't, they would likely have to transfer us up to a different hospital where they had more cardiology equipment where they could figure out what was going on.
Yeah, the other hospital that they would have transferred him to was about an hour north from that hospital. So we were really hoping that that didn't happen, just because things were already complicated enough and difficult enough. And luckily that medication resolved the issue with the heart episodes. And so luckily we were able to just stay at that hospital.
Still on day 7, they also were still weaning the oxygen. When we went in that day, I think he was down to 4, and then I think it was cool because like while we were there, we were like, okay, we're gonna try lowering it a little bit, and I think by the time we left, we were down to 3 liters a minute, which was great news to see that he was at least progressing in that aspect.
And the next day, day 8 in the NICU, we were really surprised to see that he was down to 2 liters a minute. And so that meant that we were able to start trying feedings by mouth. And he was showing the other signs, like cues that he was ready to eat, where he was just kind of rooting and he acted hungry. And so the first time that we fed him, I decided to breastfeed him, and it actually went really well. We were all really surprised because we had to weigh him before and afterwards, and he took like 30 milliliters of fluid. And so I remember thinking like, oh wow, this is awesome. He's such a good eater. Like once he heals, like we're good to come out of the hospital so soon. I was really excited about that. And then for the next feeding that day, we decided to try a bottle, and he was just really tired. He hardly took anything from that feeding, which was fine. We decided to just take the win that he did really good with that one feeding. And so anytime that he wouldn't take his feedings by mouth, they would just put the feedings in through his feeding tube.
So the doctors had had some chromosomal tests done on his DNA since they were a little concerned about the dimple on his back and the choanal atresia and then the little heart episodes he was having. The results for the DNA test came back, and he did have a insertion and a deletion in his DNA, but the chromosomes that had the insertion and deletion didn't really have a lot of research around them, so they didn't have any conclusive evidence to support if these chromosomal abnormalities had any relevance to the issues that we were seeing with his health.
It was actually interesting because they were kind of expecting to see certain results about certain chromosomes just because of all the things that were going on with him, but then those parts came back normal, and so they were kind of confused, but you know, they wanted to do the test to get some more information.
So on day 9 when we came in, they were still weaning him off the oxygen. They were down to 1 liter a minute, and it was 26% oxygen to help him to get his oxygen levels up. Room air is about 21% oxygen, so they were adding a little bit of supplemental oxygen still to the air that they were giving him. The amount of oxygen they were putting in was getting down pretty low.
He was doing really good with weaning off of oxygen. He was still not doing very good with feedings. We don't know what happened that first time when I fed him. They said it could have just been a misreading on the scale, but I could tell like he ate really good the first time, but then all the other times he hardly ate anything, and it was just really difficult. It was kind of frustrating, but we knew that we had to be patient with him because he was learning how to eat, just because in the womb he wasn't breathing through his nose, and so it was something that he had to learn how to do, and he had to build up the stamina to be able to suck and breathe and do all the things that come with eating. So day 10, he just had another heart episode. They weren't super concerned about it because with the medication and with the nurses trying to intervene a little bit, it went back down and it didn't last too long. And the reason why he had the heart episode was because they were trying to put his feeding tube back in because he pulled it out. And they said it might have been irritating the surgery location, so it might have been because he was in pain. And so then they would try to alternate and have it in his mouth or through his nose. So that was the reason why they figured he had the heart episode. So on day 11, there was an occupational therapist that was there at the hospital, and she would go visit the families and she would help the babies work on feeding. And so we heard that she was just like a miracle worker. People called her the baby whisperer, like that she was just able to help babies improve so much. And so we were excited to meet with her. And so the first time that she came and saw us, we tried breastfeeding and it did not go well at all. Kenai was just crying. He was really frustrated. He didn't eat that much. And so she was so funny and nice. She was like, I'm so sorry. I feel so bad that it went so bad this first time. And so she said, okay, if you guys are still here next week, if you'll let me, I'll come back and then we'll keep working. So that was all that happened that day. And then day 12 was Kenai's first time wearing clothes, and he just looked so cute in clothes. We loved it so much. We took a million more pictures just because he was wearing clothes. It was just something fun and exciting to be happy about.
Then on days 13 through 15, he didn't really have any huge milestones that he met, but they were continuing to wean off of oxygen. He was kind of just staying around 1 liter. They would go down to half and back up and then down. So it was just kind of the slow process of weaning. On day 15, they did decide to take out his nasal cannula so that he was no longer on oxygen, and then he was just breathing room air like the rest of us, and he seemed to be doing pretty okay with that while we were there.
During this time, he was still just kind of struggling with his feedings. He wasn't taking that much. Breastfeeding was just extra hard. He would do a little bit better from the bottles, and so it was just kind of a very slow process where we were seeing just very little improvement day to day.
Kenai being off oxygen didn't last very long. Day 16 we came back in and he was back on oxygen with the nasal cannula, still on 1 liter, but they said that he just was having a little bit low oxygen, so they put him back on the oxygen. Around this time, I think on day 17, we decided that we wanted to just try to exclusively bottle feed Kenai because we had been researching other people's stories and we had heard that some people had had success feeding their babies through the bottle where they weren't doing as well with breastfeeding. So we thought that we just wanted to try to give Kenai the best chance to get all of his feedings in. So we thought that maybe if we tried just the bottle that he would take more of his feedings and that we'd be able to come home with him sooner.
The next day we met with the occupational therapist again and we told her our plan, how we wanted to focus more on bottle feeding. She was really reassuring because she asked me if I wanted to do breastfeeding like at home when he went home, and I told her that I did. And since she knew that I had breastfed that I breastfed Isaac for up until I got pregnant with Kenai, then she said that she was confident in me. She said like, oh, you know what you're doing, so I'm sure you'll be able to figure out breastfeeding if that's what you want to do. But she thought that it was smart for us to focus on bottle feeding, and so that's what she worked with us on, having him take the bottle. And then after that we did start to see some improvement. For the next week, that was all we really worked on. There wasn't really much change or improvement. It was just kind of focusing on feeding. Sometimes he would do good and then he would jump back down, but then little by little over time we did notice that he was starting to take a little bit more in his feedings.
So the progress with his feedings was going by really slow. We had hoped that it would go by faster. We were always just like, oh, maybe he'll get his feedings down in a couple days and we'll be able to come home in 3 or 4 days. But those 3 or 4 days ended up being closer to 2 weeks in the end, because he had to take at least 75% of his feedings that they were giving him by mouth, and he was around like 30 or 40, and then he would go up a few percentages. He'd have some good days where he'd be up 50, 60 and then drop back down. So overall it was just kind of like a few percentage points each day is what he was going up. The nurses also gave us the chance to start to give him swaddle baths. So they showed us this video about how babies really like to be warm and how bath time sometimes doesn't go well for babies because they're too cold. But they showed us a technique that you can use where you keep the baby swaddled and you keep the swaddle wet with warm water so they feel nice, secure, and warm while they're taking the bath, and then you slowly kind of uncover them and wash parts of their body and then cover them back up so that they stay warm while they're taking a bath. And I thought it was really neat because I remember when we gave Isaac his first bath that it was a pretty terrible experience because he was just screaming the whole time, but Kenai seemed to really like it when he was in that warm swaddle while we were giving him the bath.
What was also nice about the bath was afterwards they also had this like heater, this giant heater that we would bring over, so we'd just take him out of the bath and he'd be right next to this heater, so he wouldn't be cold even if we were changing him, which we don't have a heater here, but it was really nice, and it was just so cute to be able to give him a bath and do something else where we can interact with him more. So on day 26 of being in the NICU, Kenai finally reached having at least 75% of his feedings be taken by mouth. And so the nurses told us that he just had to continue doing that for another 24 hours. And if he did, then he would start his feeding trial the day after. And so that day he actually did keep that up. He had over 75% of his feedings by mouth. And so we were really excited that we were finally starting to see that improvement. And so day 27 was when they started the feeding trial. And so they took out his feeding tube and they told us that as long as he kept having more than 75% of his feedings by mouth And as long as he kept gaining weight, then he would pass the feeding trial, and then we would start getting things ready for us to go back home and get him discharged. And so the good news was he passed his feeding trial, and so we were so excited. On day 28, we started to do different tests and get things ready for him to be discharged. He had the car seat test done. He also had an oxygen test done, which was pretty cool because they had this little helmet. It looked like he kind of looked like an astronaut, something that they put over his face. It would just see how much oxygen he needed, if he needed to still come home on oxygen. And so they were just doing all the tests. They were giving me information. I was talking to a home health company to have equipment for oxygen in case he really did need to come home on oxygen, which he did. And so we were just kind of getting all of those final things figured out. And so that night we stayed at the hospital. The reason why they wanted us to stay the night was since he was still coming home on oxygen, they wanted to make sure that we felt comfortable with using the equipment that he would be on, like the oxygen, the concentrator, and the monitor. They wanted us to kind of have a trial night where if we needed any help, we could call the nurses and ask for their help. And so they put us in a private room, so it was us and Kenai. And we were really excited to be there with him and be able to spend the night with him, because we weren't able to sleep at the hospital, and every day we would have to go back home to our house and then drive over there. So it was nice to be able to spend a night with him. But that night we did not get hardly any sleep at all. Well, first of all, he's a newborn, and so he sleeps like a newborn, and so he would wake up to eat or to get changed, or just because he woke up. And so I would get up in the night with him, and it was also really hard because it wasn't our bed, and so, you know, it's always hard to sleep somewhere that isn't your bed. But another thing was that his oxygen concentrator was really, really, really loud. I remember at like 3 in the morning, I honestly thought that the nurses were playing like ping pong or something, and I was like, they're so loud, they're in the room right next to us just playing ping pong. And no, it was just the oxygen concentrator. And his monitor also kept going off, it kept beeping. And so just trying to troubleshoot those things and take care of him, I didn't get very much sleep that night. But he passed, he did good throughout the night. He still did good with his feedings. His oxygen was okay, even though the monitor kept beeping, it was fine. It was just having a hard time reading. But they gave us the okay that we were able to go home. That morning we just packed up the things. We were able to say goodbye to the nurses, say goodbye to the NICU, and go back home.
Yeah, it seemed really unreal when we finally got the green light to go home. It was great. We took some pictures, and then we were just glad to get him in the car seat and load him up in our van to go home. I remember that was so exciting.
We were just so grateful to have Kenai back home with us, and we were so happy to have Isaac finally meet Kenai. That was something that we were just so excited for. It was really hard for us to not be there for both of them at the same time. And so I felt really guilty. That was something that made the NICU even harder. But we got through it, and we're just so grateful for the doctors, the nurses, all the medical professionals that helped Kenai. And we're just so grateful to have him. And he's healthy, he's doing good.
Thank you all for watching. Please let us know if you have any questions about any of the specifics, because I know we just gave you a lot of information, but we're happy to share anything that you guys would like to know more about.
If you have a baby in the NICU, or if you're going through that right now, just know that you will get through it. I know NICU time is weird and it feels like an eternity, but we're just so grateful for our experience in the NICU. We really did have a good experience because of the nurses and all the people working there.